Hello and welcome to the program. Ukraine continues to appeal to international courts over violations of certain conventions by Russia, which are a result of its broad-scale aggressive policy. Now, Ukraine expects that international courts will oblige Russia to compensate for damages inflicted on Ukrainian citizens and legal entities. To talk more about the ongoing cases Ukraine has against Russia, we welcome to our studio today Scott Martin, who's a managing partner at Global Rights Compliance. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
First, for viewers to understand, you're working with the ICC and the International Court of Justice. What is exactly the aim of these institutions in general, for an overview of their role?
Sure. Just for the purpose of clarity, we don't have any relationship with the International Criminal Court. Global Rights Compliance, or GRC, is an independent entity that's been working with your government since 2015 on ICC, or International Criminal Court related issues. But just to continue, the matters that we're working on with Ukraine as it relates to the International Criminal Court relate to an action the Ukrainian government took in 2015 and 2014, where they lodged what are called declarations. These declarations granted the International Criminal Court the right to exercise its jurisdictions within the territory of Ukraine.
Now, there are special cases, special events, which are under scrutiny, especially from the ICC. Can you tell us more about those cases?
Of course, yes. And I think reference just take one step back before I take one step forward. Okay. And the step back will be to first procedurally describe where they're at. They're still in the context of what's called a preliminary examination. And what that means very broadly and briefly is they're deciding whether a reasonable basis exists to open up an investigation. Now, assuming that happens, which I expect personally, in my opinion, they have indicated that there are a number of crimes that they're contemplating. And perhaps, should you want me to, I can run through some of them in Crimea, and first in Crimea and then in eastern Ukraine, in parts of eastern Ukraine. In Crimea, in the most recent in the most recent report by the ICC, and this was back in December of 2018, the ICC indicated that it was looking at the following crimes: enforced disappearances. That is a pretty clear description of a crime. They're contemplating allegations of torture. They're looking at the transfer of civilians from Russia into Crimea.
So reshaping the demography.
Yeah. And from Crimea into outside territories. And they're looking at the illegal seizure of property, all public property. And I think the ICC noted up to 280 private companies, cultural institutions, educational institutions, so on and so forth. There are a number. There are a few others that I don't recall off the top of my head. In eastern Ukraine, I should say quickly. This is information they received. At this stage of the proceedings, it's not an investigation, as I noted. Instead, it's information they received. And they've received, as of December 28 December of 2018, they've received 86 information communications. And these are from perhaps state authorities, interested individuals, and civil society organizations. In eastern Ukraine, they documented that 2,700 civilians had died thus far, and that's compounded by more than 9,000 injured civilians. They noted that they've received information on up to or surpassing 1,200 crimes that could fall within their subject matter jurisdiction. That includes treacherous killings. One can recall the Battle of Ilovaisk, where there was a negotiation for the forces to withdraw.
So-called safety corridors, which actually transformed into a massacre for Ukrainian soldiers.
And that would be considered, possibly, depending on further investigation, that could be considered a treacherous killing as a war crime. They have looked at the use of child soldiers. and that is using or conscripting individuals under 15 for active participation in hostilities, and that's on the separatist side, of course. They've looked at, and this is a significant concern of the international community in general. The ICC has noted it in its report of shelling during the conduct of hostilities, and how some of that shelling took place in residential spaces, and the consequences of that being possibly considered a war crime for intentionally attacking civilian areas. Murder and torture are, of course, of serious concern, and one recalls the treatment of the POWs after the Donetsk airport, where mistreatment of people who are outside of combat or hors de combat, the mistreatment of the dead, and other actions are being looked into.
So the ICC received all these reports and is, as you said, examining this report to see if they can further investigate and have, let's say, Russia in front of a court. Now, is that likely that Ukraine is able to successfully take Russia in court on these charges?
Sure. Just a small clarification. It would be the ICC prosecuting Russia. Unlike the International Court of Justice, where you have Ukraine v. Russia, the European Court of Human Rights, Ukraine v. Russia, this wouldn't have that same characterization. However, the likelihood of success, if you worked from the preliminary examination stage and then you transferred into a full investigation, and then from that investigation perhaps arrest warrants were issued, the one important quality that you need is state cooperation. And that's not likely to be forthcoming from the Russian Federation. We have one recent example that exemplifies this, and that's the issue of the Georgian complaint. Georgia, after its war in 2008, which I'm sure your audience is well familiar, has had a preliminary examination done, and an investigation was opened. Russia explicitly noted its its unwillingness to cooperate, and in addition to that, it removed its signatory status to the Rome Statute to perhaps further demonstrate its unwillingness to cooperate.
So, because that would mean, and I'm also thinking about the situation of Ukrainian sailors taken in the Black Sea, who are supposed to be under the status of prisoner of war. And it's a status which is refused by Russia because it would mean that Russia would have to admit that it's actually participating in that war. Sure. Is there a way to circumvent this lack of cooperation from Russia on that matter?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to compel cooperation in this context, in this legal context within the confines of the ICC. You can work to prevail upon the state, perhaps Europe, France, and those helping to try and negotiate the Minsk agreements could help to promote the idea of cooperation, but it's not at all a requirement. And you can see also other grand international actors like the United States indicating its unwillingness to cooperate with the ICC. Recently in their I think it was unwillingness to grant visas to certain individuals who investigated ICC-related issues. So it is challenging, but I don't think that it means there shouldn't be still fervent effort to if an investigation is initiated, not to still try and work towards the eventuality of potentially arrest warrants being issued against separatists in the East or the Russian Federation itself. And I think you never know, times can change. There could be negotiations as part of a peace settlement where individuals could be handed over for prosecution. And I think that getting everything on record also carries value for posterity, but also just in general. If the ICC can conduct an investigation, if it does, and it gets names, and it gets actions, and those actions then help establish the hierarchical chain of command, then you're looking at a system and you're looking at a set of very well thought out investigative documents that could have a multitude of different uses.
So you're saying that the ICC and taking Russia into court potentially is part of a framework, and let's say a geopolitical framework. You talked about peace negotiations. It would be one of the tools there. Can we imagine that in the future?
Well, I'm offering that as my opinion only, and I, as having at least some modicum of experience in this field, and knowing that the international environment does contain some overlap of politics and law, and geopolitics, it doesn't strike me as an unlikelihood that perhaps we could contemplate or consider that the handing over of certain suspects could happen in a political framework.
Now, this is not the first time that the ICC or certain international courts have been doing the headlines. I'm thinking about the Balkan War, for example. Can we imagine some scenario where, of course, it's going to take time, but let's say the conflict is resolved, and can we imagine and can Ukraine learn from certain countries and certain justice process that already have been put in place in certain countries? I'm thinking of the Balkans, for example.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand your question correctly. I think that's a large part of the work that we're trying to promote here. And we're using some of the lessons learned from the Balkan situation in promoting the capacity to identify, to document, to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate upon war crimes. We've been speaking the last 10 minutes or so on the importance of the ICC preliminary examination and the importance of Ukrainian state authorities and other actors to have a full capacity to understand this. But most of the international criminal justice work happens at the domestic level. And so lessons learned from the Balkans have been transmitted. And I know that firsthand because we have been learning from the Balkans experience in implementing and prosecuting IHL violations in country and working on developing the capacity here.
So if you're saying it happens at the domestic level, what can Ukraine, what sort of challenge are awaiting Ukraine, and especially in this moment of, and it's going to be, election and the second round of election soon, what is awaiting Ukraine, and what can Ukraine do more to go through that process of justice, international justice here?
Develop the legislative and regulatory framework. It's currently a bill that we put together with a lot of different national actors, particularly the Center for Civil Liberties and Konstantin Zadoya, to reform the Ukrainian criminal code, to allow it the full breadth of different IHL violations and crimes under the International Criminal Court. You can work to develop further the capacities of the national investigators on war crimes, develop again further the capacity of the prosecutors, and then finally the judges. They will be responsible for a majority of the accountability processes in relation to this conflict.
So it begins at this layer and then it can be transformed into something bigger and on an international level. That's basically what you're saying. Yeah. And now, and to conclude this interview, it's not the first time that you're in Ukraine. You've been traveling back and forth in this country.
Sure.
Are you optimistic on a personal level on what's happening in Ukraine now, and what if Ukraine might be able to resolve this problem sooner or later?
I'm very much optimistic. I'm not privy, obviously, to the peace negotiations, but I am aware of the hard-working nature of the civil service here and of the civil society here. I have been now here about 4 years and constantly impressed with the commitment that they've shown to becoming stronger and better the law enforcement agencies at the work they do.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio for this overview. That was Scott Martin, Managing Partner at Global Rights Compliance. Thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.